Welcome everybody to this panel session today where we're going to be talking about command and control versus agile and how leadership can learn to let go. My name's Emma Bridger and I'm the founder and director of People Lab, and this is a topic that's really close to my heart, and I think we've got a really interesting and thought-provoking conversation lined up for you today as I'm joined by my esteemed panellists who I'll let introduce themselves in just a second. We haven't got a lot of time today though, so I'm going to get stuck straight in. And Mark, I'd like to come to you first, if that's okay. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and I'm really interested to find out from you your thoughts on how COVID has perhaps enabled us to move a little bit faster into the world of agile, and a little bit about what you're doing in your world to bring this to life.
Great to be here with such a good bunch of guests. And intro would be, I'm the Managing Director for Marketing and Digital for Direct Line Group, a general insurer, UK-based. There's a paradox here, which is that actually we think that COVID has allowed us to accelerate down our agile path. Very specifically, we went into an organisation-wide consultation process on February the 26th. You couldn't really make it up, to trigger towards a full-fat, all organisation Spotify agile approach. Obviously we had to put the dampeners on. But we push forward because we know it's the right thing for us to do to succeed in the future. But the interesting thing that happened is that we think that people have sort of jumped to agile a little bit more readily than they otherwise would have done, not without bumps, to be honest, but because they've let go of some of the identity things that sometimes holds back in these moments. So, I'm worried about sitting next to Bill and Janet. Well, nobody sat next to anybody for ages. And so actually, we think people are more change ready in a way. A paradox because, of course, people's lives have been more constricted and constrained. There's meta change happening. And it's almost like operational model change is somewhat less consequential. Now, I'm not going to pretend it's a bed of roses. And we've had to go slow, particularly on some of the legal aspects of a consultation process. But now that we've stood up, we think it probably has accelerated us down the journey a little bit.
Great, thanks, Mark. Sounds like a really interesting story you've got going on there. We look forward to hearing more about it. Elke, I'm going to come to you next. Your thoughts on whether COVID's really enabled a move to agile to happen, and a little bit about you as well. I'd love to hear from you, Elke.
Yes, hi, thanks for having me here. My name is Elke Reichart. I'm the Chief Digital Officer of TUI Group, the largest integrated tourism company. I absolutely would agree that COVID has accelerated things. We had already been on an agile journey to start, from a project base, more in product-oriented teams. And I think COVID has obviously made us prioritize projects even more. You know that tourism has been one of the most affected industries from that virus. So we really had to go through a reprioritization of our projects. And what we have been doing is really measure them in terms of the business multiples these projects deliver. And in the past, we usually had an equation from €1 invested, we generated at least €2 in business value. We are now more at a ratio of 1 to 4, because obviously we are even tougher in the prioritization. But that, in general, has also brought home to more and more people at TUI that IT is not a cost center, but a real value driver, a business multiplier.
Great, thank you, Elke. Great to hear about that. Rob, I'm going to come to you next, if I may. If you could introduce yourself and give some thoughts on the topic of how COVID's helped us to really bring agile to life in organisations.
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and hi, everyone. So Rob Doepel, I lead our energy and resources practice here at EY, which is around about 1,200 people working in that sector for us across our firm and around 60 partners. And I suppose for a professional services firm, in many ways, we're quite used to working in a very agile and very project-based environment. But maybe pick up on Mark's comments as well. I think this way of working and this life of living in front of a screen and having conversations with people or virtual teams has probably really enabled us to even take the next step on greater agility in the way that we form teams, particularly for us on a geographic basis. one of the big things that we've been trying to do as a firm is get more globally integrated and create more globally connected teams. And I think one of the things we've experienced is, this COVID has actually accelerated that and accelerated our ability to execute on that ambition. And I think breaking down those internal barriers, which is, I think a lot of what agile management is around, is trying to take the best from the different parts of your organization and bring teams together that can execute. And it is interesting in terms of, it's been a difficult year, hasn't it? But that is a massive positive, I think, coming out of it is, the willingness of our staff to accept and work in different ways, and actually also the way we've let technology sort of lead that and enable that. So, so some positives are coming out from a difficult year of leading through COVID.
Thank you, Rob. Really interesting to hear that viewpoint. And Chris, over to you. Last but not least, Chris.
Yeah, hi Emma, thanks. Chris Baker, I'm the Managing Director at Anaplan, a software company that helps companies plan more effectively and ideally turn change into advantage. So I think what we've learned, and what we've probably all learned during the pandemic, is actually how agile or not we actually are. And I look at it from the people perspective. So I think what we've learned the most as leaders is probably how to trust and empower people in that kind of environment, whilst keeping them accountable for the goals that we set. And that's been a real challenge, I think. And we've done a lot of work to sort of keep an eye on people's accountability, but not being able to walk around an office and seeing if somebody's struggling, if they've got their head down. I can't go and ask them, come and have a cup of tea, or let's meet for a drink after work. So we've learned how to basically give people a hug at the right time, and perhaps give people some direction at the right time. So I think what we've learned is that what people call situational leadership is really, really important right now.
Thank you, Chris. So really interesting to hear about the different experiences from different organisations. And I think one of the key themes coming out already is that, whilst we're not downplaying the negative side of the pandemic, clearly it's impacted all of us. On the plus side, there have been some kind of opportunities here to implement, agile, move things more quickly. So I'm going to go back to the questions. I think it's fair to say that, Agile's definitely been having a moment for quite a while, really. I was running a workshop recently talking about how to get buy-in to human-centered design, to design great experiences for people. And one of the delegates said, actually, don't call it human-centered design, just saying you're doing something that's agile and you'll get buy-in, which I think is very true. Mark, you mentioned in your intro that you've been going through a huge transformation process, huge agile transformation process. What does effective agile management look like in your experience?
Well, a bit like Elke said, we started the journey probably 8 or 9 years ago when we set up an internal digital services function run entirely on agile methodologies. But it was set up as a walled garden, sort of outside of the organisation, protected. And then a couple of years ago, it docked back with the mothership and became a core central function inside the business. And then stage 3 was then to federate not just all our digital resource, but all resource, and move to the whole model. So it has been quite a journey. I think the leadership context for this, and it's maybe a polarizing term, but it is about servant leadership, and that's not a cliche. My doctrine, I suppose, comes from playing rugby at a reasonably competitive level, where the philosophy of leadership was very much it is a privilege to learn to lead. It's not a right, and you should really respect it and realise that you are there to serve. And I think that genuinely is the case, and it is the role of the leader to help to create flow. Now, that doesn't mean you're off the hook. You've got to know enough and be connected enough to know when to get in the way and when to get out of the way and be an unblocker. But I think it's probably the most challenging part for leaders, as frankly, the behaviours and mindsets is the more challenging part than the methodology for everybody. But specifically for leaders, I think that notion of letting go is the hardest part, because it talks to ego, giving up, personal loss. And I went through a change curve where, I could get the idea that I'm not really in control of anything. I'm just sort of facilitating and helping to prioritize and maybe set the overall vision and missions. But, truthfully, it's a really big deal to jump to that and still feel like your self-worth is still there. So yeah, I mean, I do wholeheartedly believe in the concept of servant leadership, as much as a philosophy as in practice.
Thank you for that, Mark. Really interesting. I know when we've talked about this before, I personally have a bit of an allergic reaction to the term servant leadership. As a psychologist, it makes me feel something quite powerful. I kind of go, oh, the word servant doesn't really kind of bring positive connotations to me. But Elke, I'd like to come to you next, because you've got a really interesting take on this. And I love the way that you have just kind of slightly tweaked the terminology. And I love your kind of explanation of this. So come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So it's very similar to what Mark said, but I coined a different term for it, coming from an IT, where you say in IT, everything is a service in the meantime. Software is a service, infrastructure is a service. So for me, I coined it for my own leadership philosophy. I coined the term management as a service. And I have that in place in several years. And what was really fascinating for me during Corona is that it's even more applicable in a crisis moment. Because I think we all had to be bad weather captains. And everybody can be a good weather captain, but I think Corona has demanded that we all become very well versed at bad weather captains. And bad weather captains means, for me, it was being even more visible for our teams, for my colleagues, for my bosses, for my whatever stakeholder we have. So to be even more visible, to be more around, to be even more approachable than ever before. So for me, honestly, this Corona crisis has driven mass management as a service even to a next level. And I think what we had to do at TUI, as we were so heavily affected by that, we had to make decisions really very shorthand, within hours, within days. We had to make very drastic decisions that usually would take weeks and months for everybody to buy in and to socialize. And I think here again, it is so important that you have this management as a service mentality to be available. If the team needs you to have a decision in, an hour, you need to be around. You need to be available for them. So yeah, I will keep going down that path even more so now.
Thank you, Elke. I absolutely love that, and I'm gonna steal that with pride. Management as a service, and that works for me. So thank you for sharing that. Rob, I'm going to come to you next, if I may. Just thinking about this challenge, and Mark's already mentioned this around letting go. How do we help leadership to let go? Have you got any thoughts on that, or any experiences you can share on that?
Yeah, I think this comes to the heart of it, doesn't it, Emma, around it being an effective leader in an agile environment, and I think a lot of it comes to sort of the confidence of a leader, and actually really starting to address some of the insecurities that we all have, but also as a leader, I think the command and control aspect sometimes does help those insecurities that you when you feel as a leader that you're not doing enough, or you're not driving things hard enough, you're not on top of things, that sometimes those insecurities can drive you to that command and control sort of mindset. So I think the agile thinking, and I think the challenge is and I love the terminologies that Elke and Mark have shared. It is that ability to be confident that by setting out the direction and being, I always talk about being absolutely razor clear and razor focused on the outcomes, and really clearly articulating the purpose and our outcomes. What are we trying to achieve, and how are we going to measure that success? And really setting that and communicating that over and over again, and then having the power, I suppose, and the confidence and trust in your teams to then pull yourself back and give the space and give the empowerment. So my phrase is always around empowered leadership. How do I empower my teams? How do I empower people, my partners, and my other colleagues? I set the ambition, but then I have to empower them, and my role is to help them achieve it. not drive them to achieve it necessarily. They can drive themselves if they're empowered and they know where they're going. Then I need those teams to be self-motivating and self-driving. So I do think the challenge, a lot of it comes back to the insecurity and confidence. So I think as leaders, and I know my bad days, I think back why my behavior is changing, and I think sometimes it comes back to that little bit of a chimp on the shoulder starts chatting away at you. The insecurities come forward. You think you're not doing enough, but sometimes that thing to do is to trust the process, step back, and think about what you can do as a coach and how you can empower your team, and not switch back into perhaps a different way of leadership, which we know is not as effective as empowering your teams.
Absolutely, music to my ears, all of that. Thank you for sharing that, Rob. And Chris, I know you'll have some great thoughts on how we really help leaders to take that step back and genuinely empower their team. So what thoughts from you, Chris?
Yeah, and building on what Rob said, I think the approach that I've seen work really well is when a leader is open and almost vulnerable, because we've all got our frustrations and challenges with hitting the goals and still being accountable. And it can be a lonely place in your living room, bedroom, or dining room, especially during these times. So we've built a few programs to help with that. So when I have a weekly all hands to communicate, and the thought of having a weekly all hands before the pandemic would have been impossible to even think about because of the planning. But it's more chat show style. Interviewing people who've got some best practice, sharing the frustrations, being very open as a leader about my very own challenges in those environments. And what we asked the employees when we surveyed them after the first lockdown was around what do you miss about the office interactions with colleagues? And basically it was the impromptu, random conversations, at the coffee bar, at the coffee queue, where you can check in almost how you're doing, what's going on. So we've spun up things like Cafe Europe, which randomly appears in the diary to simulate that kind of environment. And it's all those other interactions that are outside of the formal communications that really matter. So we've sort of opened up more communication and more check and balances. But and that's helped me be more vulnerable and more open. And I think it's generally helped people feel a bit more empowered as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Some really good practical tips there, which I think are really helpful. Just want to come back to the culture. So it's a small word for a big thing. We talked a lot about, empowering people, enabling people to be more vulnerable. And we're interested in your views in terms of, how you genuinely help to create a culture that allows people to do that. Because I have seen sometimes, companies talk about agile and say they want their leaders to be agile, but leaders, when they start to tentatively dip their toes into the agile waters, the reality is that that there is kind of more of a fear culture. I'm not allowed to make mistakes. I'm not allowed to fail kind of culture. So any thoughts on the kind of the culture side and what you found works in terms of starting to move the culture to genuinely embrace and support an agile way of working? And Mark, I'm going to come back to you for your thoughts on that, if I may.
There's obviously no silver bullets. Culture is something that can be defined as the worst behaviour that's allowed, and therefore it can be a lowest common denominator thing. But I think, of course, it starts from the top. And, we're very lucky to have Penny as our CEO, and she really leads the charge on that regard. And very much, as Chris said, shows her personal vulnerability and struggles along the way. But I think there's a really interesting point that's happened through COVID, is that I think it's never been clearer, the link between the way you treat your people and the way that your people will then treat the customer. So we've seen record ENPS, employee NPS, and engagement scores that have then flowed through to record consumer NPS scores. So I think that the imperative is there, but it's no silver bullets. It takes work, it takes focus. It's been very deliberate. We have a really clear set of values, a really clear purpose and vision, and we talk to them very clearly. And through our quarterly business review process, where we set our objectives and key results, we try and make all of that as vivid as possible. But I think there's one thing that does get missed from the conversation when we talk about culture. Everybody's mentioned empowerment, I have as well. And I just had a completely refreshing thought around that the other day. And I must attribute Raluca in the team who brought this to my attention. And it's very much like the trust one where, trust is trust. Well, no, trust has two parts. Do I trust that person's intent, and do I trust their capability? Because you need both. And around empowerment, we just sort of toss it around as a very general thing. But I think there are some component parts, broadly psychological empowerment and structural. And psychological talks to identification to goals and vision and the right empathy of leadership. Structural talks to you are actually fully empowered to make those decisions, maybe within a framework. And of course, the advent of COVID has meant that we haven't had structural empowerment. It's been crisis management and very much dictated to by markets and consumers in a reactionary way. And the literature says it's better to have perceived and psychological empowerment if you don't have structural empowerment, even though it's illusory, than it is to have obstructed empowerment where people do have freedom, but they just don't feel it because they don't identify with the goals or the managers don't act in that way. So I just think we need to be a bit clear about COVID is constraining, and in a way, agile is constraining. You must use these methodologies, you must have these ceremonies, you must use your story points. It's quite a technical constraining thing. And so there is a little bit of a risk that we fail on the true empowerment of our people just because they see the constraints rather than the liberation. So I just thought it was an interesting twist that often gets missed from the conversation.
Yeah, I love that, Mark. As a psychologist, I'm going to, but I think that's really interesting around the kind of the mindset piece, which I know is something that you've talked about before. Genuinely believing that you have the empowerment and you can work in this different way is probably more important than actually the tools and processes. So I think that's a really interesting point. Elke, have you got some thoughts in terms of how we can move towards creating a culture where we can behave in this way?
Yeah, and it relates very much to what Mark also said. I remember when I joined TUI nearly 3 years ago, there was a fear when we started or accelerated on this agile transformation that agile is anarchy and autonomy. Everybody does whatever he or she wants to do. I think that was a little bit, if I exaggerate now, but the worst fear, of the upper management. And so I think it's important for everyone to understand that agility or agile way of working comes with a lot and even more accountability, in my opinion, than in this control environment, where obviously you give away as an employee a lot of accountability to the leadership. Agile makes you as the employee very much more accountable than ever before. And I think when we show that, exactly like Mark said, it comes, with really quite some structure, story point, epics, measuring burn down rates, but more importantly, that it's result oriented. This is what I love so much about it. And I think what also got our top leadership buying into it, that they could actually even track results more easily, more transparently. But that needs to go hand in hand. So I think by going down agile, you need at the same time work on the transparency of your measurements, sharing that with your team, ideally make it available anytime, at the fingerprint anytime. We now in the meantime have reporting that all our teams, all our leadership team can access anytime they want. And that takes away a lot of unnecessary work for the team to provide PowerPoints, etc., for any review meetings. But on the other hand, it also gives a lot of trust in the leadership team that they can always check on the progress and see it in a very transparent way. So you just need to understand you need to do it hand in hand.
Yeah, some really, really great points in there. Thank you for sharing that, Elke. Rob, thoughts from you around culture and how we create the right culture for Agile?
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation, isn't it? Because and I love the term. When I think about culture, I always think about it as evolution, not revolution. And I'll admit, many of my clients, when I hear the call, we're moving to an we're going to transform to agile. It's sort of I take a deep breath because it's. I think the experience is probably on the first iterations. There's more car crashes than there are successes when people make an organizational move to agile. And picking up on some of Elke's points, I think the structures that existed. Actually, people move to agile and they just recreate the same level of structures and same level of control, and they just do it in a slightly different way, and you end up with huge amounts of reporting because we're agile, we've put responsibility, but at the same time we want to know what everyone's doing at every single point in time, and sort of you do get a situation where there's the chaos it's not so much chaos of people going off and doing undisclosed things. The chaos is more you've created an organizational and management chaos because you're trying to run your management method through in a completely different environment. So it is an evolution, and it really starts with it starts at the top, as Mark said, around leadership, and it's a belief. And I think sometimes when these trends come forward, people skip through the belief and skip through really understanding what it means. A little bit time really reflecting on what it will mean for the culture of the organization and what it will mean for the leadership, what it will mean for you personally, and personalizing that change. So I think it starts at the top, and then you've got to think about it as an evolution, not so much a revolution. And some of your team won't make it. Some of your leaders won't be able to operate in that world. And I think about some of the programs that I've been involved with around trying to implement agile methods and agile way of working. Sometimes it takes a second iteration of it, and that second iteration, some of what changes is some people change. So the leadership, some leaders are not set up to be successful in this world, and sometimes you need to evolve to the next generation of leaders who are more comfortable in working in this environment. I'm not saying that you can't change your spots, but I am saying that some people will struggle to let go from a style of leadership that they've been coached in and brought up in, and will find it too foreign. So I think also we should go a little bit easy on ourselves. I think we're very quick to monitor and progress, and people want to see success quite quickly. And another conversation I hear constantly is we've moved to agile, it's not working. We're not getting the results that we thought we were going to get in working in this way. Is it working? Is this the right process for us? And I think that's really where you get to the test of the belief. Do you believe in this? And as a management and leadership team, are you going to see the course and stay the course? So culture is about beliefs, behaviors. So I think it's gives, I suppose, a little slack and a little bit of freedom to say this won't happen quickly, and it's okay for it to take a bit of time, because cultural change and embedding new ways of working, embedding different ways of thinking and new belief systems takes time. So I suppose that's one thing I'd say is we should all be a little bit easy on ourselves when we're going through these big transformations to move and operate in a very different way, because it is hard and it takes time, and not everyone will move at the same pace.
Lovely. Thank you, Rob. Some great points there. I'm sure lots of people are nodding around the room. Chris, going to come to you. Thoughts on culture and agile?
Yeah, it's funny what Bob was saying. I was smiling because I find myself saying, stop giving yourself such a hard time a lot. I say that a few times a day to a lot of people that are giving themselves a hard time. But I think in terms of culture, I mean, culture is something that sort of should be rigid and relatively fixed in most organizations, just like the mission statement and the goals of the organization. So when I think about culture in an agile perspective, hopefully once agile is understood and people understand the processes and they have the right tools in place, it is empowering. And so the culture should become one of trying out new things, adjusting processes, failing fast, and giving people permission to be creative and to be innovative. And that can be incredibly powerful for an organization in terms of giving them advantage. But you need to understand agile. You need to have the right tools in place so that you don't sort of break the organization. So I've seen it happen in a number of organizations. where people have that culture, sort of almost a mindset where they know the tools and the processes will work, so they can try things new, they can be creative, and and as long as you can fail fast, then it's okay. The other thing about empowerment is quite interesting. So I say to people, we have an empowering environment. We want people to feel empowered, be creative, but the reality of that is the return from the individual contributors and the team members is, in return for that empowerment that management grants them, we want to see a strong sense of personal accountability coming back. And when you get that cycle going, you can have a scenario where people will. It's almost like the analogy is you give them just enough rope and you catch them. If they go too far or they start to sort of be too creative. So it is a fine line. I think Rob and Mark articulated it quite well in terms of where you go. But I think a good agile manager has an idea of what's going on, and perhaps who they need to keep an eye on and who they can truly empower. And I think we haven't got time today, but I love the sporting analogies. A great sports coach has a relationship with their mentees on the sports field that enables them to try new things and hold them accountable at the same time. And that accountability is welcomed, and that direction in coaching is welcomed. And again, a sign of a great agile culture that's working.
Lovely, great. That's a great point to finish on. Thank you so much, Chris. A big thank you to the panel today. So Mark, Elke, Rob and Chris, a really interesting, insightful conversation. I hope you found it useful. I think the key takeaway for me is really to go back to that belief and that mindset piece to make this happen. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you found it useful.